afternoon. I want to start by joining the chorus and thanking the organizers so much, particularly Scaidoni and John Tortorici. It's a signal pleasure for me to be here. First of all, the Mosse program is what made possible graduate study for me in history. And I look around here and I see so many of the mentors and students and colleagues in both Madison and Jerusalem who have so much shaped the way that I think and write about the past. And secondly, my own grandfather, Fred Katz, was a refugee of Germany. He was born in Frankfurt am Main in 1920 and arrested on Kristallnacht, made his way to the United States. He had to leave school at the age of 14 and never was able to complete a formal education, but was an avid lover and reader of history. So it's a particular pleasure for me to be presenting in Berlin. And now for something completely different. On the early morning of November 8th, 1942, American-led Allied armies began Operation Torch, which was at that time the largest amphibious landing in recorded human history. They arrived quickly in North Africa, setting the stage for the liberation of Southern Europe, creating a second front, crucially in World War II. What is far less known is that their way into Algiers was smoothed by a band of young Jewish idealists and a small number of conservative French businessmen and military officers. In the wee hours before the Allies landed, this motley crew of shopkeepers, doctors, lawyers, and students, and a few military officers took over all of the key strategic locations in Algiers that were controlled by the German Vichy government that ruled in North Africa, and they also put many of the leaders of the regime under house arrest. Now, this all occurred in the face of major obstacles. There were promised arms from the Americans that were supposed to materialize several times in the days before the landing and never did. They were operating, therefore, with pre-World War I Lebel rifles, American tour buses, and armbands that were actually crucially successful in disguising them as members of a local pro-Vichy militia. As many as 85% of the insurgents were Jewish. This was a signal opportunity for Jews because they had lost their citizenship in 1940 in October. 70 years earlier, they had been granted citizenship in Algeria with the Crimea Decree, and it had been stripped away. And now, by joining the insurgency, they were, in a sense, reasserting their French patriotism and citizenship. But the successful Allied landing and soon the liberation of North Africa by the Allies did not bring a return immediately to the pre-war status quo. In fact, it took almost an entire year for Jews in Algeria to regain the French citizenship that they had lost. Now, this is a remarkable story, but it's very little known, and it plays almost no role in the writing of the history of the resistance during World War II, either Jewish or non-Jewish. To the extent that there has been a literature on the November 8th movement, it has generally followed one of two paths. First, as a kind of appendage to the military history of Operation Torch, and secondly, as a sort of story of North African Jewish glory during the war. In fact, it has much greater implications. It's a paradoxical story because it combines liberal idealists and traditionalist conservatives, emancipatory impulses, and an ardent defense of empire. I would say that one of the key reasons that it's worthy of greater attention is that it exposes contradictions that have been overlooked for too long because of sharp binaries in the way we write histories of both the Holocaust and colonialism. And that's where I want to focus in my paper today. Now, the most striking facets of the Algiers insurrection can only be understood in the larger context of the Holocaust in North Africa and European political culture in Algeria. You might be wondering what I mean when I refer to the Holocaust in North Africa. And indeed, by far the greatest atrocities took place in Central and Eastern Europe. But the nearly 500,000 Jews in North Africa also suffered significantly as well. There were an extension of many of Vichy's racial laws that were propagated in southern France into their French North African territories. This included massive stripping of people of their property in an effort toward economic Aryanization. It included sharp quotas in a slew of professions. And in Algeria specifically, school children were forced almost entirely out of public French schools by autumn of 1942. And of course, the most devastating thing was the stripping away of citizenship. I should also mention that there were more than 100 labor camps in North Africa, and Jews were frequently signaled out there for particularly harsh treatment. So the question of whether or not we speak of a Holocaust in North Africa, which is a live debate, really therefore becomes one of definition. Some scholars would argue that unless the outcome of escalating anti-Semitic measures in this era is extermination, you can't really talk about it as a region affected by the Holocaust. I would argue, by contrast, that the large penumbra of anti-Semitic legal discrimination, violence, concentration that took place in Nazi-controlled territory is in some fashion part of the history of the Holocaust. And by that definition, North Africa certainly is at the margins of that history, but well within it. Now, the severity of the measures that were enacted in Algeria specifically was not a coincidence. Pre-war settler culture in Algeria was saturated with anti-Semitism. You had a very strong tradition of anti-Semitic political parties in Algeria, and much of the settler population had never accepted the idea that Jews could be equally French. In part, they were haunted by the prospect that the much larger group of indigenous people, Muslims, who outnumbered them 7-1, would become citizens and would completely upend the hierarchies of colonial Algeria. So, in the same way that Algeria had been annexed to France across the 19th century, in many respects, during the Shoah, it was an extension of Europe on the other side of the Mediterranean. But the Algiers insurrection is a resistance movement that does not follow the models that we are most familiar with from Europe. In the French case, we know the most by far about the Gaullists and the Communists. History is written by the victors. And here we have an image of a resistance that is avowedly anti-fascist, anti-Vichy, and anti-Semitic. This was in no way an anti-fascist movement. In fact, many of its participants were simply aiming to restore French honor and renew the fight against the Germans. So we take, for instance, the so-called Committee of Five, which was a group of French businessmen who coordinated many of the movement's operations. Their leader, Henri d'Astier de la Vigerie, he was a committed monarchist. He'd been a member of the far-right Action Française in the 1930s. Jacques Lemaire-Dubreuil and Jean Rigaud, other members of the Committee of Five, they were members of the Cagoule, a far-right conspiracy to overthrow the Republic in the late 1930s. So these were not anti-fascists. And they supported many of Vichy's ideological underpinnings in its ultra-conservative National Revolution program. So we have to rethink our understanding of resistance in light of this movement. The Jews who took part were, unsurprisingly, very different in their outlook. Many of them were, in some tacit way at least, supporters of de Gaulle's Free France movement. They also were particularly concerned about the fate of Jews of Algeria. And so they had been among the earliest to organize, particularly in a self-defense group called the Gras group in late 1940. And the mission of that group included taking an oath to fight to the death against the Germans and to liberate France and to defend Jews. Now, this meant that José Aboulker, the leader of the Jewish insurgents, and Henri d'Astier de la Vigerie, the leader of the Committee of Five, they knew they could not work together without some kind of understanding that ideology would not be foregrounded in the movement. And so they actually reached a formal agreement that politics wouldn't play no role in the movement, and that they would work together for their common interest, which was to support the Allied landing, and that once the Allies landed, they were free to go politically their separate ways. So this mixture of strange bedfellows and pragmatism defies our assumptions about the ideological stakes of both Jewish and non-Jewish wartime resistance. And that view is even more the case when we consider the majority population in Algeria, the Muslims. A very small number of Muslims took part in the movement of November 8th. But they forged their own paths of resistance. Significant numbers of Muslims were in the communist resistance in Algeria. Hundreds of thousands were involved in fighting in the Allied liberation armies, ultimately. And they simply, in a sense, had very different stakes at this moment. So much so that in the period from the liberation in November of 42 to the reinstation of French citizenship for Jews in October of 1943, many of the leaders of Muslim political groups in Algeria pushed Jewish leaders hard to demand not only the reinstation of their own rights, but equal rights for everyone, saying, look, now you're in the same situation that we have been. You see the uncertainty of citizenship, and everyone faces the same challenge. In the end, the Jewish leadership understandably, did not follow this course. They said, we're going to push for our own rights first, and we hope that we can then support the rights of Muslims thereafter. And in fact, they did that. The Federation of Jewish Societies of Algeria in 1944 put out a statement supporting the greatest possible reforms for Muslims in Algeria. And that year did bring significant reforms. All Algerian Muslims had citizenship. All men could vote, although with not fully equal voting rights. The Natives Code, which was this notorious list of 33 penalties only for Muslims in Algeria, was abolished, but it did not produce the total kind of equalization of Algerian society that many people had hoped for. Now, I could say a lot more about the Algiers insurrection of November 8th. That's why I'm writing a book about it. But I'm going to transition now to the larger plane of big debates about the Holocaust and colonialism, the historical relationship between the two. Now, the pioneers of this question were a series of post-war thinkers like Hannah Arendt, Aimé Césaire, W.E.B. Du Bois, Jean-Paul Sartre, and others who worked hard to try to draw analogies, echoes, relationships between the conduct of Europeans in overseas colonies and the events of the Holocaust. And in about the last 25 years, a number of scholars have reanimated this conversation, and they've sought to draw upon the ideas of those early thinkers. None has been more influential than the so-called boomerang thesis of Hannah Arendt. As this thesis has conventionally been understood, it's the idea that after trying out a series of racial ideas, practices, measures in their overseas colonies, Europeans saw those come back to the continent in much more lethal and devastating form in the case of the Holocaust. I would divide the scholarship of the past 25 years into three broad strands. The first is one that makes sort of large analogies and continuities between European racial ideas and practices overseas and the events of the Holocaust. German historian Jürgen Zimmerer has been a leading exponent of this perspective, and he has cast it as very much a product of the post-colonial turn. And the way he defines post-colonialism, I think, is important. He says it's the understanding that, quote, colonialism was and is not only a system of rule, but also a general relationship of power, a mental framework that capitalizes on the construction of social groups, for example, colonizer and colonized, as binary opposites. These opposites are enshrined in a process of othering, which attributes certain characteristics to both collectives and emphasizes difference. So this, in part, allows for analogies to really enter the picture as much as precise empirical historical connections. And Michael Rothberg has also worked with the post-colonial critique in a different vein to draw connections between the era of decolonization and post-colonial critique there and what he sees as a potentially fruitful relationship with commemorations of the Holocaust. The second major approach overlaps with this first one, but it focuses strongly on continuities in German history between various forms of empire under the Kaiserreich and the aims and methods of the Nazis in the Shoah. And I would say we could divide this strand into two territorial spaces broadly. That is, one has focused very strongly on German colonial East Africa and the genocide against the Herero and the Nama. And there have been linkages of ideology drawn by some, methods, personnel. Isabel Hull's important work has focused on military culture and its orientation toward brutally destructive, what they called already final solutions, and the way that this habituated certain methods in the German military. And the other space has been that of Eastern Europe. And when you have scholars like Mark Mazauer and Wendy Lauer who have argued that there was a much older dream of Lebensraum on the part of the Germans that they were able to carry to their extreme in the case of World War II, and that became coupled with Nazi racial ideology to produce the full horrors of the Holocaust. What I find striking is that none of the scholarship on the Holocaust colonialism question, as I would call it, has considered closely the North African case. Here is a long-standing, indisputably colonial territory where the Holocaust arrived in abortive form. The first two strands I've just described would be hard-pressed to incorporate the North African case for reasons emblematized by the Algiers insurrection. That is, this scholarship has nearly always relied upon a set of binaries where Nazis are either connected or analogized to colonizers, and Jewish victims are either connected or analogized to colonial subjects. And in the case of the Algiers insurrection, that doesn't work. Here you have a group of Jews who were legitimately seeking to free themselves from Vichy persecution and the prospect of Nazi annihilation, but they were in no way fighting an anti-colonial war. I've described briefly how they had a very ambivalent relationship to anti-colonial demands. What they're mostly fighting for is effectively a status of colonial privilege. Now, I think the third strand of recent scholarship on the Holocaust colonialism question is in some ways more promising for the North African case. This approach emphasizes the importance of the Holocaust as, of colonialism as context for the events of the Holocaust. So the importance of imperial rivalries in the late 19th century and the interwar years as pushing Germany toward the desire for a great empire. The importance of the creation of that empire in the East as suddenly a vast geographical context in which Germany ruled over millions of more Jews, Slavs, and Roma against whom they would carry out genocidal practices. Doris Bergen, who I think is here, has also written about the way that the context of empire seeped not only into the minds of perpetrators, but also victims. And so she's noted, for instance, how Victor Klemperer in his diary uses categories that mimic the assumptions of colonial subjugation, or about how in Auschwitz we have prisoners who make reference to Gandhi or to the famous Musulmaner of Primo Levi's account. And here we find echoes of the situation in Algeria described by none other than Hannah Arendt during the war in a very perceptive piece that she wrote in 1943 in the Contemporary Jewish Record. Arendt saw the contested history of the Crimea Decree as emblematic of the way that two Frances, one in the mainland and one among the colons, the colonists in Algeria, had sharply contrasting visions of the meaning of French colonial rule. So she writes, quote, "While the national government sought the naturalization of the Arabs and regarded the Crimea Decree as a beginning and a way to attract the Arabs by the privileges it gave to its citizens, its intentions have been frustrated during the last 70 years by the colonials, who used their legal power to prevent naturalization of the natives." And she focuses in this essay on why it was that in March of 1943, several months after the Allied landing, General Henri Giraud, who's the Governor General of Algeria at the time and had been a participant in the landing, why it is that he, while getting rid of a bunch of the racial laws, re-abrogates the Crimea Decree, that is guaranteeing that Jews cannot regain their citizenship yet. And she says this is not simply because of Nazi anti-Semitism extending to North Africa or because of Vichy. Rather, she says it's the last manifestation of a long-term struggle over the character of Algeria. And she describes Giraud ultimately as, quote, "an agent of those French colonials who always wanted to bring under their dictatorship the only part of the Algerian population that so far had escaped their arbitrary and selfish rule." This is no boomerang theory, then, of anti-Semitism growing, in the Holocaust growing out of practices in the colonies. Rather, it's an illustration in real time of the way that the relationship between empire and the Holocaust in Algeria was in no way foreordained, but was actively being contested at this moment between those with very different visions of what colonialism in Algeria should mean. Now, let me conclude by turning briefly to our inspiration here, the late George L. Mosse, to help us elucidate these complex issues. Of course, as Enzo Traverso and others noted yesterday, Mosse was not a historian of French North Africa, nor someone who made the so-called imperial turn. But he did devote much of the last 35 years of his life to various systems of exclusion and othering, and in particular to their interrelationship. And in fact, Mosse perceived the force of the Holocaust colonialism question, if we look closely, earlier than most, as in so many cases where he anticipated later work. He writes already in the prologue to the second edition of Toward the Final Solution in 1985, quote, "From the vantage point of today, too little is said in this book about imperial racism." He goes on quickly to defend this, however, by writing, quote, "We are examining the history of European racism, and while imperial racism was a part of this history, it was within Europe itself that racism was to achieve its goal and was able to express its true implications. The extermination not of rebellious subjects or unruly elites, but of a whole people represents the climax of racism, and no mistaken analogies to colonial wars or to colonial suppression must disguise this fact." Now, somewhat paradoxically, in the same book, Mosse actually also gives very unusual level of attention for his time to French Algeria. And he describes the anti-Semitic movement in Algeria in the 1890s, which as among the early cases of, quote, National Socialism. He, for instance, describes a week of pogroms that were orchestrated by Max Régis, the mayor of Algiers in 1898, as, quote, for the first time a violent and consistently racial policy had been implemented against Jews who were caught in a vice between French colons and Algerian Muslims, and exposed to popular hostility as middlemen and shopkeepers. Now, he gets around the seeming contradiction by noting that, quote, Algeria was not properly speaking a colony, but a department of France itself. This is a legally accurate statement, but it is also a brilliant dodge, since, as I have noted and as many other scholars have written much more extensively about, Algeria was a profoundly colonial hierarchical society under French rule. But I think Mosse, by implication, gets two very important things right, and I'll close here. One, his caution about tying too close of a link between histories of empire and the Holocaust without being very precise remains well taken. Two, he suggests that Algeria specifically was in many ways a version of Europe in French colonial North Africa. His account here implies that the story of a kind of French National Socialism had deep roots in Algeria that played out during the war and the Holocaust, albeit in much more limited fashion. In this manner, as a site of both emancipation and persecution, where Jews were linked both to possibilities for Enlightenment progress and brutal destruction, Algeria formed a distorted colonial mirror of Mosse's Europe. Thank you.